Good evening. Welcome to the November 2019 Nats Chat. I'm Kari Ragan, the organizer and moderator. Nats Chats are sponsored by Inside View Press, and tonight's is co-sponsored by the Voice Foundation, and therefore I'm joined by co-moderator Peggy Baroody. Thank you, Peggy, for being here.
Kari, thank you for having me, and I'd like to invite all of our listeners to attend our annual symposium, which is held in Philadelphia this year from May 30th to June 3rd. We'd love to have you join us for a very exciting time.
Oh, thank you for that, Peggy. And we are joined tonight by Lynn Helding and Lynn Maxfield, who are, of course, very familiar to our Nats members and beyond. So I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. Lynn Helding is the coordinator of vocology and voice pedagogy at USC Thornton School of Music. She has recently published in Scott McCoy's book, Your Voice and Inside View, the 3rd edition, a chapter called The Brain, which is remarkable. Strongly encourage that. And you can now pre-order her book that is going to be published with Rowman and Littlefield, called The Musician's Mind: Teaching, Learning, and Performance in the Age of Brain Science. And she also was the creator and editor of the Mindful Voice column in the Journal of Singing, which is now edited by Dr. Lynn Maxfield. And Dr. Maxfield is the Associate Director of the National Center of Voice and Speech and an Associate Professor at the University of Utah School of Music. So thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kari.
And I'll take the promotion, but I'm actually still assistant professor.
Assistant professor. I need my glasses, clearly. So last year we had a wonderful conversation on motor learning part 1, and we kind of broadly discussed motor learning theory, focus on motivation and its importance to motor skill acquisition, practice and feedback, and many rabbit holes along the way. But tonight we're going to turn our attention to the locus of attention. So Lynn and Lynn, I would love for you to give us broad strokes about the external-internal debate of locus of attention and what we're talking about with that.
So Lynn M., shall I take this one and run with it? We had a little pre-meeting meeting to decide how to organize this.
Drew straws.
Yeah, drew straws. So, so in this field of motor learning, the issue of where one should place one's attention in both learning and performance is paramount. And if you stop and think about it for 1 minute, it becomes apparent, why that would be. So when we're training in the motor realm, we're training physical skills. So motor stands for motor neuron or movement, and so the issue has been, should we be thinking about the mechanics of that movement? Should we be issuing verbal instructions to our body parts? Cock your arm at an angle, keep your wrist loose, or should we, in popular parlance, go with the flow, which in attentional focus theory means, should we focus on the goal of the movement rather than the mechanics of the movement that it would take to get us there? That's one explanation. Some other explanations have even taken it more broadly to say that an internal focus of attention is thinking about your body at all while you're doing what you're doing, versus an external focus or locus, as in location, of attention, which focuses on the movement's goal. So in singing, that might be something like issuing mechanical directions to yourself while you're in performance would be drop your jaw, access your abdominal wall, as opposed to toss that high note to the balcony, something like that. Lynn, do you want to add anything I may have left out?
No, that's a very good overview of this question, right? And I think it's important to understand too that just broadly the definition of attention is sort of the taking over of your mind of directing that your cognitive effort into one aspect. And as Ms. Helding just, I've never called you Ms. Helding, as Lynn Helding just put it, you can direct it toward the goal, or you can direct it toward the process. And that's sort of what we're going to discuss tonight, I hope.
That's a good point. That's a great point. Gosh, I love working with you, Lynn M.
Likewise.
I know. So I think that is such an important point to remember, that the cognitive effort will happen. That's the point. And so the issue is not to make it go away or wish it weren't there. And this is part of performance anxiety, by the way. You can't cure it, but you can ameliorate it. And guess what? By figuring out where you're going to direct your attention, because it's going to happen. The question is, where do you put it? And so that's the topic of tonight, is locus. Where should we place it?
Yeah, because the other side of that too is to remember that effort, that attention is limited. You can only place it so many places. So
it may be too early to ask. Sorry, it may be too early to ask a question, but is this a concept that varies depending on where a person is in their studies?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. So maybe we should just give sort of the overview of the debate, because it is a raging debate right now in motor learning theory. And in part because the studies that have been done are pretty robust in favor of external focus. And so this has caused an awful lot of people to then extrapolate from that. And in fact, one of the major researchers, Gabrielle Wolf, has stated pretty unequivocally that her research has shown that this pretty much applies to all motor pursuits in all domains, which that's a pretty broad statement. So we have to look at things like complex skills versus simple skills. That's one of the topics I think we need to discuss. And then, as you mentioned, Peggy, where is the learner in their continuum? Are they a rank beginner? Are they still kind of a newbie? Are they, a journey person somewhere on their way to their 10,000 hours? Are they an expert? And then if they are an expert, how long have they been an expert? Have they been an expert for 20 years? Are they a senior in their 50s or 60s? And do they need to retool because of injury, or perhaps just by choice? So these are all really important chunks of the conversation, for sure.
I find that with the motor learning theory, it often is, they haven't yet done enough with singers. That's where I get a little frustrated. And, I of course have read the research, not as deeply as you two remotely, but I always think, sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Well, you're onto something. Maybe Lynn M knows about this, but the last time I checked, the only study on singers that had been done by Lynn Maxfield. So Lynn, do you want to speak to that?
I will say, and there's probably good reason that nobody else has gone in that direction. It is particularly, it's a complex task. It's a very complex motor skill that we're talking about, and there's several elements. And what I found was just determining metrics that were accessible, or that were quantitatively accessible, were very difficult. And I'm not sure that I did a great job of it, but I tried. I will say there's another DMA student that I know of that is just finishing up his work as well, Colin Johnson at Shenandoah, who's going in this realm, but not in a prospective clinical trial site design like I did, but has some really neat findings that I'm literally looking forward to him being able to.
Yeah, me too. So I think, Kari, that's a great question, because that's one of the issues that is raised, and it's one of the things that caught my attention as well. So just to back up a little bit, not only have there not been there've been very few, count them on one half of one hand, studies on singers. There have been very few studies on musicians in general. And then the next problem that we have with making these broad statements based on motor learning theory, in my opinion, is that many of the studies are based on simple tasks, not complex tasks. Many of them involve so-called limb tasks, which is what it sounds like, your hand, your arm, your foot. And many of them also involve an instrument. So throwing a dart, one. Yeah, so and when we stop and think about what singing is, my gosh, I mean, I can't think of anything more complex. Clearly, playing the violin is complex, but we have the same things going on that an instrumentalist has, but we have that other guest at the table, which is language. So we have to be thinking, we have to have solid technique, but we also have to be convincing and emotionally connected to text. And in classical world, that means the text that may not be our native language. So it just becomes so progressively more complex. And when you add to that, if you're doing a role in musical theater or opera, you're looking at a conductor. You're trying to, remember your blocking. You may be dancing. I mean, I can't think of anything more cognitively complex than being a performing singer. So I think,
and the fact that the number of variables is only compounded by the fact that you are not only the player of the instrument, you are the instrument. And yeah. I think that adds a level of complexity that I can't even wrap my head around. I so appreciate the work you're both doing in this field. It's so critical. It's so important. And I can't imagine trying to manage any controlled study dealing with this subject. I mean, it's so complicated. There's so many variables to account for.
I don't come from that side of it. I'm just trying to really write about this pretty grand pronouncement by Wolf saying that it applies to every situation, including music. There is a person that wrote an essay for her in one of her books named Adina Morell, who wrote, or Mornell, I believe she wrote about pianists. But in the very same paragraph, she states that it's pretty impossible to tell because there are no studies. So, my issue with this sort of blanket statement is back to your point, Peggy, which is at what point in the learning process are we talking about? So there's pretty good evidence, particularly when we talk about performance anxiety, something called the constrained action hypothesis, which is when people who are pretty good, if not expert at what they do, get out there on stage and start issuing mechanical directions to themselves, yes, they mess up. They do. And we think it's because the verbal directions take longer to process cognitively than do motor commands. And it interrupts one of the hallmarks of motor performance, which is fluidity of movement, gracefulness, we might call it. So I think that's all very robust. And but what I am always interested in is what are the places, and if this is true, what are the places in our training and performance in which an internal focus is desired? And the two things we know for sure, and Lynn and I discussed, we wanted to sort of get that out there at the beginning. The two things we know for sure are rank beginners. And I say, how can a beginner go with the flow when they ain't got no flow to go with? So they need to learn what that baseline flow is before they can even access it. And then the second condition is recovery from injury, as you, Kari, and Peggy know well. And the third condition, because of what you do, right, you're helping people retool. The third condition would be people who either by injury or by choice wish to radically alter their technique. And the only way to do that is to kind of go back to square one and figure out how those pieces are put together.
And I will just kind of point out that the latter two are putting you back in the category of the first, which is you're choosing to put yourself back in that rank, or choosing, or something has determined that you are back at a rank beginner status again, in which case this internal focus may be important.
Except that as an advanced singer who has to retool and maybe have to completely redo, you have a lot of skill sets that you will utilize, that you understand, and awareness, physical awareness that you'll apply. But I certainly appreciated what y'all said in the other talk too about this interim time where you're unlearning one thing and learning another, and that great gap of time. And I so appreciated that you addressed that, because that's something that has been talked about in voice pedagogy for a long time, that there are teachers who would take a student on and say to the student, you are not to perform for 6 or 8 months until we realign things. And that's because they go through that period of, that's not irrelevant to what you're saying right now, but I really appreciated your addressing that.
But I love that. That was
no man's land.
That was one of the favorite things in the learning one, right, is that Lynn H talked about, that it's going to be messy and it's okay to be messy, and that we just have to sit in that messiness. And I think that's so important, because I think too many times teachers are trying to get somebody to the final product rather than allowing them to explore the messy.
Well, the problem, of course, too, is the demands of an academic program.
Well,
you know, especially a 2-year program where people are trying, if you're in a conservatory and they've got 2 years to turn everything around, and then at the end of that 2 years, they're supposed to be ready to compete. So when you have to retrain, I'm just saying in the context of what we're all saying.
I'd like to speak to that, though. I think that instead of taking the long view, we can also look at if you just have an hour lesson, you know, we can do that within an hour. Right? We can have that exploratory messiness and then pull back and see where we are. So this is the really important difference between learning and performance, right? So learning is messy and dynamic and unstable, whereas performance is the freeze frame of where you are at any point in time. And I like to have a lesson in which we can have both happen. You know, and that's that wrap up, you know, those last 9.5 minutes where you go, okay, let's just go for it. Let's see what happens. That's the external focus moment. And I guess my other point with this whole argument or debate that is out there in the ML world is it's not an all or nothing proposition. In fact, I hope that my singers that I work with are able to do both all the time. I would like them to be able to go into the practice room and take things apart, but they must be able to put that clock back together and go out and give it their best shot. And I have a lot of faith in the human mind. I think we're complex beings, and we are able to do both of those things in the same day. You know, it's not an all or nothing dealio.
Well, it's kind of a lame analogy, but sometimes those are helpful for me. But it's kind of like the contractor who is in renovating your house, and he makes a huge mess every day, but at the end of the day there has to be a point where you come back to at least the water is turned back on, right? And you have to be able to leave that learning session able to put some things together before otherwise it will continue to be a mess when you return to it. So you have to be able to get it back to the point where you can practice again. So I've always kind of had a problem with the idea that, oh, I have to deconstruct you and you're going to stay deconstructed for 6 months
yes.
before we go on. We have to be putting you back together at stages and allow you to feel that success, because that experiencing the successful approach is another essential element to motor learning. You have to be to a point where you can experience having the successful, what's the word I'm looking for?
Trial, you mean it?
Trial, yeah, that's the word. Yeah.
And both of you spoke so eloquently, I thought, to the psychological needs of the singer or performer to have those positive moments, either from the teacher and the positive experience themselves and the autonomy, and how important that is to self-confidence and then to learning.
Oh, it
And
absolutely.
acquisition of skills.
There's
Mhm.
no question. And that's a simple one. I've talked about this for a long time, that even people who are so-called, tough love proponents, it doesn't work. It's just that simple. Being mean to people, yelling at people, scaring people, it just doesn't work. Regardless of whether you think it's right or wrong, I think it's wrong, but it doesn't work because it calls up that fight or flight response, and you will not get the best out of someone in the physical realm when their body is screaming at them that they should panic and run.
This is not a safe learning environment. This is not a safe place for them to experiment anymore.
No, no. But I think the flip side here too is, and this is the part I want to make sure we also get out front early on, is I do think I see a lot of singers sort of beginning of professional career, let's say late 20s, early 30s, that will come to me because something's not working. They're not, and how do we know? Because they're not getting jobs. Things are not happening for them, and it should. So that's the big question, right? And I often will start a session like that with asking them why they're there, and I will often hear something like, "I don't know. I think I just have to get out of my own head." So there's a lot of this talk of, I need to get out of my own head. I just need to get in the flow. I just need to trust myself. And with all due respect, I understand that feeling, and it's in the zeitgeist, and it's been there since the 1970s. This go with the flow idea, that is precisely not what these people need. They actually do need to do a deep dive into their technique and figure out what part of it is not serving them well. And for some people, that is just such a revelation. And we were talking, Lynn and I were yesterday, this book by Carol Dweck that I cite a lot, about mindset. And she talks about the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. And the fixed mindset person believes that it's all about talent. It's all about God-given talent or whatever given talent. And you have very little influence over that. Whereas growth mindset people believe that it's, that there's a huge latitude for them to improve. And she says something like, it's astonishing the degree to which fixed mindset people do not believe in work. And that's stuck with me for over a decade. And it's this same idea that how has go with the flow been serving you? And clearly it hasn't in this cohort that I mentioned. So if we can dig down, and as Lynn M said, can we take things apart? But by the end of the hour, I'd like to at least have the water back on. I'd like to have something functioning really well so that they leave feeling like, wow, I really can do this, but I'm going to have to go through this exercise protocol to strengthen some musculature that's weak, to get some musculature offline that's been taking over and squeezing and pressing in ways that are not helpful to me. And what I always say with people with motor learning, the dirty little secret is it's very possible to inculcate new habits very quickly if you devote yourself to the everydayness that's required to become strong and fluid and efficient, those things that we look for in motor performance. It's not that difficult, really. And we're singers, we can't practice 8 hours a day. We can't probably even practice 4 hours a day. But if you could do some of these protocols, I ask people, can you do a half an hour a day? Can you do half an hour 5 times a week? Sure, I can do that. Well, you're going to see some improvement. You absolutely will. But as Lynn brought up earlier, it's cognitive effort, and that means we have to do things like turn off our cell phones, off, and be totally in the moment. And we can make pretty amazing changes. And then, as I always tell my students, when your half an hour is done, I want you to literally close the book on that. You've done your protocol. It's like the curves gym. You know, you check off those boxes of those things that you said you would do every day. Some days are great, some days aren't, some days are kind of eh. But over time, you should see an improvement. And I don't want people to wait 6 months. I want them to tell me 2 weeks later, oh my gosh, I'm starting to see improvement in these places. This other place still needs work. I think that's been my experience with this approach.
And it's, you know, it's really incumbent upon the teacher to provide that specificity within that protocol so that they were practicing effectively. And I think that is an area for our profession to really explore and improve on.
That's your evidence-based pedagogy.
Yeah,
It absolutely is. I mean, and you're right. And what's so beautiful is that information is out there. You know, we know that for a range of vocal challenges that there are specific protocols that really work.
Somebody has asked to supply the book name for the DUEC, the Fixed versus Growth. Could you tell us that? Do you know that title?
Mindset.
Mindset. Thank you. Someone's asking.
Somebody else can look it up, but I think that's right. I should know this. You know.
Let me, while we're paused here, I'll share a question with Sandy Hirsch, who's a fabulous SLP here in Seattle. She says, sometimes I have my clients engage in completely unrelated motor tasks for 1 to 3 minutes to sort of clear the pathways and then have them come back to the voice task. Do any of you do that? And what is your success?
Lynn M., what do you think?
I'm trying to think. Anecdotally, I think we've all kind of hit that dead end when we're working on something, and we can see that we're just not moving past that anymore. We're not making progress, and I think, yeah, I certainly have had success in moving to an unrelated task and letting the nice thing is you can kind of let the subconscious continue to work on that problem while you're away. And then when you return, and I do encourage you to return if you can, if there's time in the session, come back and try that again. And oftentimes, yeah, you'll have some success because the elements of the learning are there, they've been placed, but you're not overwhelming the system by just continuing to experience the incorrect trial, right? The incorrect solution to the problem.
I would add to that, I've written about this in my book pretty extensively, but I don't think it's in the McCoy chapter as much, about the importance of space for the learner to process the information. Yeah. And this is something that I think, you know, I stand guilty as charged here, but so many of us singing teachers are guilty of because we're talkers. And we'll we'll give them, you know, a task, as they say in motor learning theory. So in our world, it's to sing a phrase after we've discussed it and we've discussed what we're going to try again differently. And the importance of not saying anything and really letting the student process that information without us rushing in there and telling them what they felt or telling them what they should be thinking is huge. And that's really robust in some later, more recent motor learning research. So the value and the power of that old question that many of us ask, which is, how did that feel? But then we need to just not say anything.
I am an evangelist of that idea to the 10th degree. I totally 100% believe in it. I will also admit it is darn hard to do. It is just hard to experience that dead air, you know.
What I love about it, though, is that oftentimes their response takes me in a completely different direction than what while they're singing, I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I always start with, so how does that feel? What was your experience? And I stay quiet, shockingly, me, yes. And I'm often surprised, and I'll say, well, that's different direction than I had planned. Let's go there.
And you know what? I've had the same experience, Kari, in asking someone to try something, and they sing again, and it sounds better. And I say, well, I know what I asked you to do. What did you actually do? and let them describe their own experience. And sometimes it's very different from what I ask for.
Whether it's motor learning or any other type of learning, the research is pretty darn clear that student-directed learning is always most efficient. When they can be the guides to forming their hypotheses about why that worked, it always leads them there in the most efficient route.
I think our challenge is just how do we help them get there? How do we build that paradigm in a studio from a rank beginner up so that they can learn that way, which is the only way they're going to retain the information.
Well,
there you go.
There's a great tool, because I mean, this is the thing, right? Everybody always wants to know how, and that's been my my question for several decades. I love to talk theory as much as the next person, but people get frustrated, right? And they want to know how. So for all of you out there, here's your tip. It's called performance cues. And performance cues are funny little sayings of not very many words, because many words are cognitively effortful, that contain the information that you want to remember. So, you know, in my pedagogy class, I have a couple of slides up, and I try to make it really obvious. So I'll say something like, once they've learned their intercostal muscles and their abdominal muscles, the abdominal musculature that is related to breathing, and I have all those fancy schmancy words up there, and I'll say something like, upon inspiration, relax your rectus abdominis so that the diaphragm is allowed to descend into the abdominal cavity, therefore displacing the viscera. Right, you get the point. And I just try to lard it up with as much stuff as possible. And then in the other, the contrasting slide, I just have a picture of Santa Claus, and I have the words Jelly Belly. And right, so yep. The idea is that, especially if you want to be a teacher, especially if you're taking a pedagogy class, you do have to know the entire situation of what is happening on that kind of deep breathing. But how is your student going to remember that? And I often get asked this question too: does my student need to know that? And I often say, no, they don't. But you do. You need to know so that you can give them that cue word, whatever it wants to be, so they can remember what they should be feeling or what their target feeling is. And, you know, there is the use of both internal and external. You're giving your student an external focus with a cute little cue word, but behind it, you, the teacher, really do need to have all those internal mechanics stacked up in your mind.
Well, but let me ask you the question then. The cue is external, but those who believe that the internal focus would include any concept of thinking about the body, thinking about Jelly Belly is still an internal focus, right?
Yep, that's as I understand it. But there's a great book. I'm going to pull it off the shelf so I can show it, because she's my new hero. Let me see if I can find it here.
While you're looking, go ahead and look, Lynn, because I'll share that Dan Mitten has written in and said Gareth Nair's The Craft of Singing in 2007 is full of shorthanded performance cues. It seems he developed nearly an independent dialect of these cues that he catalogs in his book. So anyway, and then now Lynn is referencing Thought in Action.
Yeah, this is a book by Barbara Montero. She was the ballet dancer, and now she's a philosophy professor, and she has written deeply and wonderfully, as only philosophers do and can, about this debate about do motor performers think about their body when they're performing? And her answer is, well, of course they do. And so that's interesting. This is such an interesting question, and I can't imagine when we're singing that we wouldn't be feeling and sensing and thinking about our bodies at the same time.
Particularly when we're in the process of learning to sing.
Yeah.
Performance, as you've already pointed out, is sort of a different bag, but the learning to sing, that's yeah, I can't disagree with you.
Well, singers are the ultimate multitaskers.
Yes.
Without question. And I would say that at a high level of singing, at A-level singing, I've heard plenty of singers say, oh my God, I was out there and I was in the middle of this and I just knew I wasn't getting enough drop and I could feel it's easy. I mean, there's all this quick, rapid, nanosecond awareness going on that is exquisitely remarkable.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is. All of that feedback. I did an article in a paper last year called Alternative Facts, and I'm still just
I love that paper.
yeah, well, it was so interesting to work on it, and I want to give a shout out to Eric Hunter, and also I have to remember his name. He helped me from Australia, but I credited him in the article to really help me understand the three sound conduction pathways. So air reflected sound, room reflected sound, and body conducted sound, which had me just flipped out already that we were getting three different pathways. And then I remember this day I was on my computer and I had been emailing this physics professor in Australia about this, and my email went ding, and he said, by the way, please don't confuse those three sound conduction pathways with proprioception. I went, what? He said, it's different. It's very hard to test, but theoretically, the three ways that singers hear their own voices and the way they feel in their body are technically four different feedback systems. And that just blew my mind. So I went for a walk, which, by the way, that's in the motor learning theory too. It's the best thing you do or cognitive theory, when you're stewing on a problem, go for a walk. So I went for a walk, and then it hit me, oh my gosh, singers have 5 feedback systems, because we're also getting what the teacher is saying to us, or the coach, if you're in a learning situation. I mean, think of that. 5 different pieces of information, which are all equally valid, hence the alternative facts. So it's back to this thing we started with when Lynn M. mentioned that it is cognitively effortful to sing. And so the question is not how do we avoid that, or how do we get away with it, but how do we manage it? How do we, where do we put all of that?
I sometimes wonder if it's in classical singing, if it's a law of natural selection, that people who not only have the voice, the instrument, which they have to have, but they have the ability to get to that cognitive state. I wonder sometimes if that's part of the picture. I mean, there's no way to know that.
Well, there actually have been some studies at Harvard. Gottfried Schlaug did some of the early imaging work on that, and they discovered that musicians, not just singers, not just instrumentalists, musicians have almost 25% larger corpus callosum. So it's the mental gymnastics of going back and forth between hemispheres. It's like brain aerobics. Pretty amazing stuff. So I do, I think that's why I say in the 21st century we can't just be training singers what to do. We have to train them how to think, because they're gonna be thinking. It's back to what you said, Lynn. They're gonna be thinking. What are they gonna be thinking about? And we can train those thoughts. We can quiet the mind, but that doesn't mean eschewing thought. It doesn't mean getting rid of it. It means hyper-focusing, I think.
And are you talking, Lynn, the hyper-focusing on the actual internal process?
The closest I've ever come to that answer is in extreme yoga. I find extreme yoga is the only thing that's similar to me from what performing felt like, in that I absolutely have to stay 100% in the moment. I cannot be 5 seconds ahead, and I sure as heck can't be 5 seconds behind, because if you don't, you will fall. If you don't stay right in, how's this feeling, you'll fall. and you'll face plant and it won't feel good. So I'm not making a grocery list when I'm doing that. I'm not thinking about what are those people in the back of the hall doing on their cell phones. And this is the problem when people have scary performance experiences, is that their mind starts racing and giving them information about all kinds of other things that aren't the act that they're engaged with.
Just on the opposite side of that, sorry, Kari, I'm sorry. Just on the opposite side for 2 seconds. I've had singers say before, if I do another task when I'm warming up, like iron my clothes or, read something or think about the grocery list, I feel like I warm up more freely. What's happening when they do that? I mean, I've heard more than one singer say that.
Lynn M., you get to take that one.
I know, I bet you $50 a bunch of teachers out there have heard the same thing.
But that's warming up. Just saying.
Well, it's warming up.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of wraps me back around to something you were talking about earlier, Peggy. Actually, you said, these performers will come off stage and they list off all of these things that they that happened, and they could express what happened after the moment. But you were amazed at how fast that happens, in the real time. And what that struck to my brain, and I think that this is maybe what's happening with the sort of distracting yourself during warm up as well, is there's a difference between conscious awareness and unconscious awareness. And the conscious awareness really only comes into play, or at least the way that we say something is conscious versus unconscious is whether it can be verbally reported. And conscious, in the moment, being able to verbally report it definitely slows things back down. But unconsciously, you can be aware of all of these things that are happening. And that what's amazing is that our attention can selectively be drawing back to the unconscious awareness, the input that it received through the unconscious channels, in order to drive you moving forward. And that to me is fascinating, because then that actually really speaks to this internal versus external debate, because we're now talking about whether or not the brain is already internally focusing on things and unconsciously. And it also takes away sort of the argument of, well, it slows you down and slows down these cognitive processes because the verbal cues are so slow to process. Well, the verbal cues aren't necessary for the unconscious awareness of things.
Let's see.
And so I wonder if that isn't perhaps what they're experiencing a bit, is unconsciously they're still bringing things. And I'll bet you ask them about what they were experiencing during that warm-up session in the afterward, and they'll be able to describe the sensations, even though they weren't consciously focusing on it in their awareness.
And sometimes I wonder if maybe they're thinking about the wrong things when they're warming up. They're thinking about things that aren't useful to them. I mean, what our consciousness focuses on has such a bearing on what we actually do. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
Well, and the attention.
I love this discussion. I just want to grab the two of you and take you home with me.
Oh, I'd love to come home with you, Peggy, Baroody.
Oh man,
you could just talk the night away. It's great. I love it.
In a heartbeat.
Yeah.
Well, we know that attention initiates voluntary action, but as it does that, oftentimes it inhibits the automatic responses that were already going to happen, and so where we focus that attention becomes very important. And you might be exactly right. If their normal thought process would have put them in an attentive process that isn't accurate, then paying attention to something else will inhibit some of those wrong cycles, that quote unquote wrong cycles that are automatic, and so they may get that free warm up.
I don't know if this is true, but I heard years ago that I think it was Joan Sutherland used to warm up whilst hoovering, vacuuming, because she just couldn't stand the sound of her own voice while she was warming up, and so she'd just hoover away. And then she said little by little her voice would come into focus.
But could she only warm up in keys that resonated and harmonized with the Hoover? Because that would have drove me nuts. Yeah.
I'd like to know if that's true. If you guys have never heard that story.
Well, that reminds me of masking. It reminds me of masking patients, voice patients sometimes. So you stop that
Oh no.
Oh no. What happened?
oral loop. You stop that oral feedback with the voice.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
We have a question from Sandy Hirsch. Any thoughts in that case about singers with ADHD or OCD compared to those without such a diagnosis?
I mean, well, there are some very interesting studies. I don't want to talk about OCD because I don't know about it and I didn't study it, I didn't write about it, but I can talk a little bit about ADHD. And without, we could talk about this a long time, so I'll keep it confined to, I think, probably the most important new research, I would say it's newish, is that ADHD is not, it's not a disease, it's not a condition. It's thought that it could be just a brain maturation issue. So in the same way that we see, people grow at their heights at different rates, right? So if you take a picture of a bunch of middle school kids at, say, 6th grade, you're going to see all the girls towering over the boys. And then in a couple of years, it kind of goes like that, and it sort of evens out. So the thinking is that there's a delay of about 3.5 years in brain development in ADHD people. Now that's not insignificant. So I say things like, imagine a student, a 16-year-old driving a car with the brain of a 12-and-a-half-year-old, and that usually gets people's attention. It's kind of a scary thought. And then there are all of the behavioral things that happen to kids who are delayed in this way and have a hard time with impulse control. So it becomes this whole complex of behaviors, and we know with the brain that you will never really be able to parse out nature from nurture. So if someone has this delayed brain growth and their environment it either helps that delay in not a good way, and they're being ostracized by their classmates because they can't pay attention, they can't focus, then it literally becomes that sort of habit of mind. So the good news is that with some brain training, there are some people that have showed really marked improvements in their ability to pay attention. But the main thing that we have to do in our culture is look at how under assault attention is. There's a book by Maggie Jackson. She wrote about attention as one of the most endangered resources. And I think as performers, we should be particularly concerned about audience attention. So, but I think that's the news about ADD, is that it's not something that, you're born with and it will be with you forever. There is certainly that thinking, but some of them, if you look on the NIMH website, Nora Volko did a study on ADHD and this idea of brain maturation, and it's very hopeful. It's very hopeful. At the same time, it doesn't minimize the really huge negative, often social consequences for kids that grow up this way. But there are also, it's been around a long time too, that there are situations in which that is exactly the kind of person that you want in your crew. So it's not all negative, but that we can train our attention, I think, is one of the most exciting things from brain science.
There's a few questions I want to just get through as we're at 10 minutes left, so please send your questions in. When we were talking about unconscious, Heather Henry says, unrelated but makes me think of similar processes as driving on autopilot, conscious versus unconscious. So there's some similarities with that. And then Sandy, I love this. I think it's easy to warm up well while doing other things if the skill set is already laid down. I don't think it's successful in the early phases of learning.
I agree with you, Sandy.
Yeah, I think we can all agree with that. This is from Anupa Paul. What advice do you have for singers who are also singing teachers? Those who know how all the processes work in the singing body in detail, and they tend to get distracted by verbal cues they give themselves when they're performing.
Wow, that's a good question.
Really
What do you
is.
think, Lynn? What do you think, Lynn?
Lynna. It's an incredibly difficult task because you have to sort of change your outlook on the task at hand completely, right? Even though it's such a related task to what you do all day in the studio when you're teaching on the other side of the keyboard. And so I don't have any great cues for you other than to continually remind yourself that you are no longer the analyst that you are on the teacher side, and you have to step back into the well, and if you're performing, then you have to step out of the learner standpoint and into the performer standpoint, and that's probably the same cue you would give your student, right?
I'd say also don't underestimate the value of working with someone else. I mean, work with another teacher.
Yeah.
Work with someone else who can get you out of your own head. That would be one of those times I would think that would be really valuable. And work with someone who knows that you are a professional and so that you can work at a much higher level together.
Going back to the autopilot car, I would say let's liken it not to the full autopilot, but with the driver assistance tools that we have now going on, right? We have the lane monitoring and the blind spot detection. All of that is going on subconsciously, but you're still driving, right? And so I think that we can think that unconsciously there's a whole lot going on, but consciously we're still pushing the gas and steering. So,
and you have to be able to count on those sensors to work.
That's exactly right. Yeah, which is dangerous. But.
Jeff Costello is asking Lynn H., could you repeat the citation, the quote with citation about how attention is a resource?
I'm sorry.
When you were talking about the attention of audience, even you mentioned the.
Oh, Maggie Jackson. I just can't remember. Just Google Maggie Jackson, just like it sounds, and attention, and her book will pop right up.
This is an interesting one. Stacy Hollyfield asks, have you ever worked with a singer who experienced sudden sensorineural hearing loss in one ear? And can you speak to motor learning for someone who trained with normal hearing and now must feel and hear things differently?
I have not.
I have never worked with them. The only thing I would say is that there is hope, and you would go back to this idea of neuroplasticity and that you can retrain different sensors to replace broken sensors. But I don't have any specifics of how I would do it in that case. That would be very difficult. It would not be a quick road.
Good. I think we've gotten through. Actually, Dan Mitten does mention another feedback option through Pansinian corpuscles. Chadley Ballantyne has some fascinating research on the implications of how we receive feedback vibration in our bodies based on pitch. So the vibratactile sensation. Yeah, go ahead, Lynn.
No, I'm just saying yes. It's Chad's work is fascinating.
It's fascinating. Good. Oh, one last one. I think we covered this earlier. This one came in a while ago. Is there any research on singers, not golfers, showing the effectiveness of internal locus in certain situations? Yeah.
I mean, what there is research showing, again, and we'll just repeat this, that there are two main subsets, we might say, of motor learners for which internal focus is beneficial, and that is rank beginners and people recovering from injury. And we would add to that people who want to retool their technique completely. So we might, in singing world, it might be, you know, a soprano who's been singing classically all her life, and she gets hired to do a pops concert, and she's got to learn how to belt. You know, I mean, this happens, right? So how would we retool that for them? Those are the three conditions in which we know that internal focus can help. But again, I really want to emphasize, this doesn't mean you pull off to the side of the road and stay there for 6 months. I personally don't think that works.
The only thing I would say about that is if a person's at a certain level of performance that is expected of them and they have to retool the mechanism to get back to that level, it depends on the level that they are expected to perform at. Bad sentence. So sometimes there is justification. While you need positive steps forward through the process, there is good, valid reasons for not performing until you reach that level of expertise that you need to be who you were. I mean, there's something to be said for that. It doesn't apply always. Certainly in recovery, it's a factor from injury. There's a certain level of expertise that has to be reobtained or reestablished before they can go out to the public. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be ballpark of what they did. But I think what you're talking about is the positive steps during the process.
Yeah, and I wasn't just thinking about performance as a goal necessarily either. But you're right. I mean, but you know, I'd want them to have some success within the hour, within that hour idea.
Yep.
Well, and I think also I would want to point out that I personally am still not advocating for such an internal locus of attention that you are focusing on elements of the technique that are not necessarily under your cognitive control or of your voluntary control. You know, thinking about the level of TA contraction and a percent activity level of different muscle activations is not helpful. It will never be. So I think that there's something to be said about the specificity of the movement that you're trying to control, and whether or not you can, you know, the gradation between internal versus external. And I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think that there might be a bit more of some gray area there in between, where you can explore specificity.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea, that gradation.
Yeah.
Right.
Umit Dazdagan, I apologize if I butcher people's names. She says there's a recent study with Gabelle Wolf, which is who you've been talking about, Lynn.
Gabrielle.
Oh, it's been mistyped, excuse me. So Gabrielle Wolf, adopting an external focus of attention enhances musical performance, in the Journal of Research in Music Education 2019. So for those who are wanting to read that, there's something for you there. Well, we are coming to the top of our hour, and I can't thank you all enough for joining me tonight and talking about motor learning. I find it ironic that I had a moment of losing my train of thought on a night that we're talking about locus of attention. There's some irony in there for sure. We'll just let that go. And I want to invite everybody, December 8th, I will have Adam Rubin as my guest, who is a laryngologist, along with his SLP, Juliana Codino, who work at the Lakeshore ENT voice team in Michigan. So that's December 8th, and I hope to see people there for that Nats chat. And thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. And we'll see you in December.
Thank you, Kari. Thank you, Peggy.
Oh, thank y'all so much. This was wonderful.
The guests want to stay on for just one moment. We'll let our